Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Humanity Now podcast. Today, I am so excited to have our next guest. We will be talking about Raya, Dunayevskaya, state capitalism, and Marxist-Humanism. Peter Hudis is a lifelong activist, historian, writer, professor of philosophy and humanities at Oakton Community College. He has authored several books and articles, including Frantz Fanon's Philosopher of the Barricades, Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism. He helped edit two books on Rosa Luxemburg, including her 14-volume book. That must have been a lot of work. So Peter is a wealth of knowledge and understanding of philosophy, history, and politics. I learned something new from him every time I listen to him. Peter, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very well. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Can you tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Well, I joined the radical movement in New York City in the early 1970s when it was a period of a lot of political excitement and activity, but it was also a period of downturn because it was following the collapse of the 1960s movements to a certain degree. And I went through the radical left, became more and more convinced of a Marxist perspective on the world, but also rather dissatisfied with what I saw of Marxist parties or left-wing currents that supported various authoritarian forms of socialism. So I was going in search of some sort of socialist tradition that could take account not only of the problems of capitalism and the need to surmount it, but also that would address the obvious problems of so-called socialist societies, whether of social democratic formations in Western Europe and elsewhere, or whether it be the Stalinist regimes in China, Soviet Union, and elsewhere. I was looking for an alternative to those things. And it took me a while to try to get a sense of the lay of the land and to find my way to a political philosophical current which at least addresses in some systematic way those sort of questions. I became an organizer for many, many years. I did not expect or even aim to have any kind of an academic career for much of my life. I was a political activist, a journalist, and a writer, freelancing. But in the last 15 years or so, I went back into got another degree. I had an earlier degree in Latin American studies. That was an early area of interest of mine. I went back to graduate school in the early 2000s in order to get a PhD in philosophy, which then helped get me a full-time teaching position in philosophy, which I continue to teach now, as you mentioned. And I've been interested in a number of different facets of radical theory and practice. Rosa Luxemburg is, of course, one of my main focus of interest. I should mention that I'm the general editor of a project called The Complete Works of Rosa Luxemburg. It's an effort to issue all of her writings in English, and it'll run probably about 17 volumes. We've got 4 volumes out so far. The 4th volume just came out to the press a few weeks ago. Prior to that, I had also co-edited the Rosa Luxemburg Reader with Kevin Anderson in the early 2000s, and the Letters of Rosa Luxemburg with Annelies Schlesiska back in 2011. So a total of 6 books edited or co-edited on Luxemburg.
Wow, that's a lot of work. I want to have you back someday to talk about her for sure. But today we're talking about Raya. First of all, can you pronounce her name for me? Because I'm really bad with names.
Break it up into 3 parts. Dunayevskaya. So Dunayevskaya.
Dunayevskaya. Okay, thank you. Who was she, please?
Well, she was born in Western Ukraine, what's now Western Ukraine, in 1910. And she grew up during the Russian Revolution and during the Russian Civil War. So she was 7 years old when the Russian Revolution occurred. She had an older sister that was about 6 years older than her that actually participated directly in the revolution in some respects. But she was, of course, very young at the time. And she was Jewish, in a Jewish community. Her father was a cantor at the local synagogue. So they were very impoverished. She grew up in a very poor background in which women were not provided with an education generally at all. But she managed to get into Hadar and managed to get into the Jewish Instructional School, which was unusual for her time. But by 1920, of course, 21, 1920, 1919, 2021 is the Russian Civil War. The White armies marching through areas of Ukraine, Red armies moving through, other forces fighting amongst each other. And attacks on Jews and pogroms were very widespread, especially when the White armies would march through these areas. So her family fled that area of Ukraine and crossed the border into Romania, and they lived in a displaced persons camp, and then were able to get to the United States shortly afterwards in 1921. So she arrives in Chicago when she's about 11 or 12 years old, not knowing, of course, any English and speaking Yiddish as her native language, and knowing some Russian, of course, but also now living in a very different place, the United States of America. She didn't want to leave Russia or Ukraine, the Russian Empire, actually, but Ukraine, what we call now. But she quickly, as a teenager, almost virtually 13 years old or so, became active in politics in what was then the Jewish ghetto, which is now where and the Italian ghetto, which is now where the University of Illinois Chicago is, right on top of when they demolished the slums many years ago. And she got involved in local communist politics. She joined the youth group of the Communist Party when she was like 13 years old, and she became an active militant, and then until she was expelled from the communists in 1927, and then she became one of the first Trotskyists in the United States when she was accused of Trotskyism for her political opinions, and she didn't know what Trotskyism was. She was simply raising some objections. She wanted to find out what is that, went to New York, found some of the early Trotskyists like James Buchanan, Martin Aburn, Max Shachtman, who were forming the incipient Trotskyist movement at the time, and she became a militant in the Trotskyist movement up until right through her time in the late 30s, where she then went to Mexico and served as Russian language secretary to Leon Trotsky during his exile in Mexico. So that's just a little bit of her biographical background before you can say her theoretical life as they began. Up to this point, the time with Trotsky and her decision to break from Trotsky in 1939, politically that is, she was not a theoretician. She was not recognized as such, and she didn't pretend to be as such. She was an activist within the Marxist movement, very active in labor struggles and also active in trying to connect labor struggles and the Black liberation movement, including the remnants of the Garvey movement that were in Chicago, that were trying to find a relationship to socialism. So she was active in many of these sort of campaigns and movements. But from 1939 onward is when she begins to move in her own independent political philosophic direction, which, of course, we'll have a chance to talk about.
Yeah, one side question. Was she aware of Hubert Harrison by any chance? Do you know?
Yeah, she certainly knew Hubert Harrison's work. I don't believe that they ever met. But she definitely knew of his work. And there is a very important phrase, a concept in Hubert Harrison, the Negro as the touchstone of American civilization, which she incorporated directly into her major work on the Black liberation movements in America, which she wrote in 1963, called American Civilization on Trial, Black Masses as Vanguard. That's her most comprehensive statement on the Black liberation movement, and she draws directly from Hubert Harrison's conception of the struggle of Black masses as the touchstone of America. That is, for people who may not know what a touchstone is, if you haven't been mining recently, a touchstone is a black rock that when you find gold, what looks to be gold, you hit it against that rock with a hammer, and if it leaves an indentation in the rock, that means it's fool's gold, not real gold. So a touchstone tells you what's for real and what's not for real.
Right. So let's talk about her break with Trotsky. What happened there?
Well, she, like many other people who were in the radical movement as the 1930s progress, of course, are raising a lot of questions about what's really happening in the Soviet Union. Trotsky, of course, was expelled from the Soviet Union. He was stripped of his titles before that and sent into exile, internal exile in what's now Kazakhstan. Then he was expelled in 1929 to Turkey and then lived various places in exile and ends up in Mexico and develops a circle of followers who are trying to oppose Stalinism from the left and create a new organizational expression of the communist movement that would express the original ideals of the 1917 revolution, which they felt had been corrupted by the Stalinist bureaucracy. But a lot of questions were being raised by Trotsky's associates as to how do we actually characterize what's happening in the Soviet Union. Trotsky himself thought it was still a progressive social formation in advance of capitalism, because he held to the notion, which was very common at the time, that that the central problem of capitalism is the existence of private ownership of the means of production, that is private property. And once you eliminate private property, you eliminate private ownership of the means of production, you have exited capitalism. Now, Trotsky did not ever believe that the Soviet Union was socialist. He understood that socialism could not exist in one country. This was a common view of all Marxists from Marxist time right up until 1917. But Stalin introduced this novel conception that no, we alone could build socialism in one country through nationalization of property. So even though he criticized that, Trotsky still upheld that the Soviet Union was a more progressive social formation compared to Western capitalism. It had gotten rid of capitalism, but it hadn't reached socialism. It was in this in-between kind of transitory stage. Now, a lot of people, including herself, and she was an original in this, in the late 30s, already are starting to question that characterization. The Moscow trials, the Ukrainian genocide, where millions of Ukrainians are literally deliberately starved to death in the name of rapid industrialization, the betrayals of the international working class movement in various respects by the Stalinist system in Russia, and add on many more. She began to be skeptical about this idea that the Soviet Union was a higher formation than Western capitalism, because the political conclusion that flows from that is, were there ever to be a military confrontation between the Soviet Union and Western imperialism, one would have to take the side of the Soviet Union, right? Now, the Hitler-Stalin Pact occurs in the summer of 1939, which is what started World War II. And that is, Hitler and Stalin sit down, through their emissaries, of course, not personally, and they decide to divide up Eastern Europe between themselves, split Poland in half. Stalin gets one half, Hitler gets the rest. And this is what enabled Hitler to, of course, fight France and Britain by 1940 and conquer France in 6 weeks, not having to worry about the Soviet on his rear end, as it were. And that's what inaugurated World War II. So now you have an alliance between the so-called Socialist Soviet Union and fascist Nazi Germany. That she could not countenance. So she, like a number of other people, broke from the main Trotskyist organization, the Socialist Workers' Party, and went into a new organization that was founded by some of the other major figures in the Trotskyist movement, the Workers' Party USA, which argued against defending the Soviet Union. But the Workers' Party, when it was founded in 1940, also didn't have a clear view worked out as to what was the nature of the Soviet Union. Was it still in between capitalism and socialism? Was it not, had it reverted back to capitalism? Was it something else? And the lack of clarity hindered that organization's development. So she decided that she didn't agree with Trotsky's position, and she very sharply broke from him. But she said, I have to prove my point of view. So she went into the library for several years, and she produced the first Marxist economic analysis of the Soviet Union as state capitalist in the 1940s, right in the middle of World War II. She was doing this work. Obviously, this is not something that was a very popular position. The Soviet Union and the United States by that time were allies in the fight against fascism. So I think we might have frozen here on the screen a little bit. But in any case, you can hear me. So at that point, she meets other people within the Trotskyist movement who had likewise come to similar conclusions as hers, and the most important being C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian Marxist who had been living in England, where he had become an active Marxist theoretician and militant. He was on lecture tour in the United States in 1940, and they met up at the Workers' Party convention, and they both submitted theses to the convention with the exact same title without knowing each other, without knowing what the other was doing, called Russia is a State Capitalist Society. Wow. And their commonality of interests led them to form a dissident group within the Trotskyist movement called the Johnson-Forrest Tendency, which existed from 1940 till 1952 as a grouping within the Trotskyist parties, but then separated out as an independent organization and lasted until 1955.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. You answered my question about how she met CLR and what their relationship was like. What were the main contributions of the Johnson-Forrest tendency to the political discourse at the time?
That's a very good question. Well, one was this analysis, a very detailed economic analysis of what was the class nature of the Soviet Union. It was not simply throwing out, a charge or a statement or a claim. What they were trying to do was to take the categories of Marxist capital and analyze the Soviet economy in light of them. Does it match up to what Marx describes or delineates as the logic of capital? If it is, it's another variant of capitalism. Or is it something else? Does it not map onto that? And they had argued that it did. So that was one, of course, political ramification of the Johnson-Forrest tendencies work, but it had much broader theoretical implications, because at the same time it challenged the assumption that most Marxists had, socialists, even anarchists as well to a certain degree at the time, the notion that private property versus nationalized property, or free markets versus planned economy, is the fundamental contradiction or difference between capitalism and socialism. This is an idea that goes all the way back into the Second International, that was founded in 1891 with its famous Erfurt program, which basically defined capitalism by the lack of planning and socialism by organized planning, of course, by the working class, theoretically speaking. Engels, I should note, who was alive at that time, very much objected to the Erfurt program's discussion of this, on arguing that capitalism has reached a point where it also knows how to plan, and socialism cannot be restricted to a definition of mere planning, because you can also have hierarchical, bureaucratic, or repressive planning. But that did not permeate the socialist movement after Marx and Engels' death. They went in the opposite direction. So the Johnson-Forrest tendency was really, in a certain sense, redefining what does socialism mean. That is, it had been taken for granted that it meant something with a rather superficial understanding, and that had gotten the socialist movement, whether it is reformist wing of the Second International in its later incarnations, or the Third International, the more revolutionary Marxists, they were still holding to this notion that the anarchy of the market versus organized, planned public ownership of property and planned production, that's the fundamental contradiction. And what they began to see is that this fails to take account of what is the real problem of capitalism, the alienated form of its human relations. Beginning at the point of production, but not ending there, extending to relations between men and women, gender relations, and extending to race relations. These were all things that were now being discussed by them as early as the early 1940s. Now, I should add to this that Dunayevskaya had been active in the black movement in Chicago from as early as 1925. She was active in the American Negro Labor Congress, headed by Lovett Fort Whiteman, a black communist that sought to fuse or unite black nationalist activists with black Marxists in an organizational framework. C.L.R. James, of course, was a very, very prominent theoretician and activist of black liberation. He had written The Black Jacobins shortly after his own conversion to Marxism, the great book about the Haitian Revolution. And they saw at the same time, that was the other contribution of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, that the traditional Marxist notion of the working class as the sole vanguard force of liberation was, in the American context, an insufficient doctrine given American conditions, and not only true of America, of course, the United States. That is, they held that the black movement had an independent validity vis-a-vis the class struggle, that even when the black struggle was not connected directly to the labor movement, the demands for liberation from racism acts as a catalyst to actually galvanize the labor movement, precisely because, they argued, class relations in American history have always been shaped and mediated by racial considerations. So to just talk about workers unite, irrespective of your class, your racial position in society and the degree of racial discrimination, fails to actually get at the texture of the class dynamic that exists in a society like the United States. So they put a great deal of emphasis, way ahead of their time, on there not just being one force of revolution, but in some contexts, multiple forces of potentially revolutionary subjects. And this also extended to at least some incipient writings that they were doing, early investigations of thinking out the relationship of gender relationships to this broader, more humanist conception of Marxism that was gradually emerging within the discussions within the Johnson-Forrest tendency. And I'll just add one more word on this. it was in the course of Dunayevskaya's research on the Russian economy that she accidentally came across what we now know as Marx's Paris manuscripts of 1844, also known as his humanist essays, the economic and philosophic manuscripts written in the year 1844, which Marx never published, which were not then in English. They were published in Russian in the late 20s, but they got very little circulation. And the man who actually published them was executed by Stalin. And they were published in German right before Hitler came to power, but didn't get much circulation because of that either. Books were very quickly banned in Hitler's Nazi Germany of such works. She came across them and begins to see Marx's conception in the 1844 manuscripts, where he talks about the need for a new humanism, for transforming the fabric of human relationships, where he talks about alienated labor, not just the alienation of the product from the producer, that is the fact that the value of the worker's labor is always less in economic terms than the value of their product, right? So you have surplus value that exists beyond the value that the worker obtains in wages and benefits. That's not the sole or the major problem of capitalism, she sees Marx arguing. It's the alienation in the very activity of laboring, the very fact that your human activity gets reified or turned into a thing in the process of your activity of working. This is the dehumanization of the human subject that really is at the heart of class domination. And it leads them to begin to see that this domination, this dehumanization, this thingification of human relations pervades other forms of existence in modern society, and it definitely shows itself very starkly in racial determinations. So this is some of the incipient ideas that the Johnson Forest tendency was developing, although they don't become, the humanist dimension does not really get singled out by Dunayevskaya very strongly, or the other members of the JFT, until until the JFT breaks up. And James and Dunayevskaya go in somewhat different directions. And she, in the late 1950s, begins to more explicitly elaborate the humanist basis of Marxism, and arguing that Marxism is a theory of liberation or it is nothing. She wrote in her first book, Marxism and Freedom, in 1958. And therefore, the humanist dimension of Marx is not something that applies only to his early writings, but it applies throughout Capital, throughout all of his writings, if one has the patience and the dexterity to actually grasp the nuances of his argument.
Excellent. That is such a great point that that Marx raises and that she discovered and you're talking about. I want to back up just a little bit and talk about state capitalism for a moment. And I want to preface this with with reiterating Raya's work, studying the Soviet Union very closely. I mean, can you just say again, like, the amount of work and effort that she put into understanding the economy and the social relations there? The work that her and James did in the group can't be overlooked. And in today, there's a lot of people that are Stalinists or view China as being communism, and we need to counteract that with the truth of the fact that the Chinese today are still alienated. The workers in the Soviet Union were alienated, and that's one of the main concepts of Marxism that we need to address, is this alienation that work does to us. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Right. About her work? I mean, she studied.
Well, of course, it's one thing. There are other people who call the Soviet Union state capitalist all the way back to, like, I don't know, probably when the Bolsheviks seized power, right? Some of the anarchists, Anton Pannekow, a very important council communist, used the phrase. Kautsky used the phrase also in the early 1920s. But it was a political charge. It was a political appellation. None of them had done any really serious analysis from an Marxist economic point of view to prove that it's capitalist. Because a society is capitalist not just because there's exploitation. A society is capitalist insofar as it adheres to what's known as the law of value, right? In other words, that the measure of society is not the useful the use value embodied in goods and services, but it's the dominance of exchange value that takes on a life of its own, and dominates all human relationships. That is, wealth measured in monetary form becomes kind of the universal equivalent and the universal dominating force of all human interaction and relations. So in order to actually make a case that the Soviet Union, which claimed to have abolished capitalism, actually did not, and certainly by the time of Stalin had become part of a new global stage of something that she called state capitalism, one had to do your homework, and she couldn't have done it without knowing Russian. And she went into the archives to dig out the material, and she did some pretty brilliant economic analysis for somebody who was not trained in the academic economic tradition, but she learned it herself in order to do this kind of work. And she produced some very, very serious studies of the Soviet economy on this. But I want to emphasize that she was not looking at this as only a Russian question, that is, or a Soviet Union question. She was analyzing state capitalism in the Soviet Union as part and parcel of a global stage of state capitalism. Because let's not forget what's also happening at the same time. You have the forced industrialization drive of the Soviet Union, which is driven, of course, by a state-centralized apparatus in which the state now owns the property, the state runs the industries, etc. But there's other forms of state capitalism that are emerging. Hitler's 4-year plans, or Stalin had his 5-year plans. That was a kind of a statist capitalism, she argues, not the same as the Soviet Union, of course, because there Hitler did not abolish private property. He did not get in the way of the corporations. He simply utilized the state as subjecting the entire society from the moment he took power to a militarization of the economy, right, in order for conquest. But it was a variant of this move towards increasing the power of the state in social and economic affairs. And of course, this FDR's New Deal, which was driven by a very, very different purpose. For the most part, this is what we now call Keynesian fiscal policy, right? Injecting liquidity into the economy through the state apparatus in order to pump up effective demand and thereby to overcome, at least temporarily, some of the cyclical crises that are endemic to a capitalist economy, which is exemplified during the Great Depression. So she sees all of this as kind of different manifestations of a tendency, okay, of statification of the economy. Now, it may sound to some people that, well, it's okay, that's all very nice, even if it's all true, but it's kind of like out of date. I mean, why are we talking about this in the 21st century? Aside from the fact that, as you mentioned, of course, a lot of people still have illusions about the nature of these so-called socialist societies, and it would do them good to learn the theory of state capitalism, to abuse them of those illusions, disabuse them of those illusions. But there's a broader problem at issue here, and that is the state has never gone away from a central role in the economy. And I would argue that we still live in a state capitalist, very much more than ever maybe, live in a state capitalist world reality. Although, again, a different variant of state capitalism than what you saw in the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist today. Even now, Chinese state capitalism is not the same as it was 30 years ago. What we have is a phenomenal development that's should be obvious for the last 2 decades. A vast proportion of the capital accumulation that's occurring in the world today is being funded essentially through state indebtedness and through financialization backed up by monetary policies of state governments around the world. Yes. Just look at the pandemic. Trillions and trillions of dollars generated as if by fiat in order to keep businesses going, okay, during the pandemic. We're not talking about, the $1,200 check you might have gotten from the government. That's chicken feed compared to the amount of money that was poured into corporations, businesses, multinationals, etc. This is what is sustaining them in a period of downward pressure on profit rates that's been afflicting the world economy for several decades. So we have we got, people bandy around the term neoliberalism as defining the state of the world since the mid-1970s, moving away from Keynesianism and welfare state directed policies towards this complete dive into the free market. That's not actually accurate. The phrase neoliberalism has its virtues, but it's also causes some confusion because it leads some people to think that the state is no longer a fundamental dimension in so-called normal capitalist societies like the United States. Well, yeah, we don't have nationalized businesses in the terms of the property relationship, but we do have businesses that cannot exist without national input, without input from the government of finances and financialization. So again, it comes back to what Dunayevskaya and James was seeing, G.L.R. James was seeing in the early 1940s already, that the Marxist movement had made a mistake in emphasizing property forms above production relations. That is, it's not the property form that's a decisive issue in the nature of an economy, although it's a very important one. But all class societies have one or another form of property that corresponds to the specific nature of their class domination. But the elimination of the property form by itself, with absent other profound social transformations, like, as you noted, transforming the alienated nature of the very process of production, is not going to get you an exit from capitalism, because capitalism can exist in a multitude of property forms, at least in theory. And I would like to say, in practice, we see one glaring evidence of it, which has a lot to do with what's happening in Ukraine today, by the way. And that is, well, what was Stalin's forced industrialization of the 1930s called by his followers, not by his critics, by his engineers who pioneered the policy? Primitive socialist accumulation. They looked back at Marxist capital. They said, how did England industrialize? Raping the peasantry, right? And of course, the unspoken statement there, not just of England and Ireland, but of raping the destruction of those laborers tied to the land in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, around the world through colonialism, and using all of that wealth to industrialize Europe, right? That's Marx calls primitive accumulation of capital. They now said, well, we can build socialism in one country by applying that method, so to speak, to our own peasantry, which is mainly located in Ukraine, and extort the value from them that we can embody in a refurbished means of production that would lead to rapid industrialization. That led to, of course, 10 to 11 million deaths in Ukraine. It destroyed Soviet agriculture for decades to come, but it did succeed in industrializing the Soviet Union, and it did succeed in enabling Stalin, after he had his falling out with Hitler, when his love affair with Hitler kind of fell away, it led to his ability to defeat Nazi Germany, with a good deal of help from the United States, by the way, military armaments and food shipments and everything else, was able to defeat Nazi Germany because of that industrial might that it had established. But it established that industrial might through a 20-year process that Western imperialism accomplished over the course of some 2 or 3 centuries. It was a condensed process, and its brutality and its murderous nature has a lot to do with that fact.
Yeah, great points. Great points. So we're going to go back to the Johnson Forest tendency. Why did they part ways? Why did the group break up?
Well, I think there's 2 basic reasons. One is another thing which I did not mention yet when I mentioned these contributions of the Johnson Forest tendency, new ideas that were coming out that were not restricted to the issue of state capitalism, such as the central importance of anti-racial struggles, the increasing emphasis on the gender question as being an important element of revolutionary transformation of its own. But there was another question that was percolating up in the minds of the members of the JFT, especially James. And he was the real inspirer of this in a way, because you have to understand, they had a kind of a division of labor. We shouldn't forget about Grace Lee Boggs, who was also the third major leader of the Johnson Forest tendency. And they had this kind of interesting kind of collaborative leadership in which each one of them would specialize in a particular arena in developing what they would hope would be a new kind of Marxism for the 20th century, mid-20th century. Dunayevskaya focused on the economic side. Grace Lee Boggs, who had a training, believe it or not, you would know it from her later work, but as a Hegelian scholar, a scholar of Hegel's work. She got her PhD at the University of Chicago doing a dissertation on Hegel in the early 1940s. And C.L.R. James, who worked in all these different areas, but also, of course, was a great historian, cultural critic, and really somebody always percolating with ideas and suggestions for areas to work on. As they are doing this various work, they're increasingly becoming critical of the traditional concept of organization that had characterized 20th century Marxism, codified in Lenin's notion of in What Is to Be Done, his work of 1902, that you need a strongly centralized vanguard party to lead the way to a proper seizure of power. They were now questioning that, saying, but we had that. I mean, that existed in Russia, but that did not stop the transformation of the Russian Revolution into its opposite under Stalin. The JFT never equated Lenin with Stalin, by the way, nor did Dunayevskaya to the end of her life, nor did James to the end of his life. With Lee, it's a little more complicated, but I'll leave that aside for now. But they certainly did not equate Lenin with Stalin, but what they were arguing was that the Vanguard Party formed in light of something that neither Lenin nor Marx himself had anticipated, namely the transformation of a revolution into a totalitarian society over the course of a decade or a half or so, meant that you had to rethink the question of organization. And they began to focus more on what we now call horizontal forms of organization, more decentralized forms of organization, party and non-party forms of organization that might avoid replicating the capitalistic division of worker and intellectual and mental from manual that generally characterized left-wing parties at the time and to a large degree still today. In other words, it's very easy to say you're against capitalism, and it's very easy to be against capitalism, just like it's very easy to say you're against racism and very easy to be involved in a fight against racism, but that doesn't mean you've overcome racist ways of thinking that are unconsciously attached to you. In the same way, it doesn't mean devoting yourself to the class struggle and fighting for the overthrow of capitalism. It doesn't mean you are free from certain elitist notions of, oh, I'm the white male, I'm the one who's the thinker and the leader, and you guys, the workers, are the ones who follow up my mandates. That kind of social division of labor is almost organic to intellectuals in a class-dominated society, and that can have a lot of negative repercussions in organizations, in movements, and in revolutions. So, by the late 40s, James especially is beginning to say goodbye with the Vanguard Party to lead. We need some other kind of organization that would replace it. Now, he wrote a book to try to think some of this out, his book Notes on Dialectics, which Dunayevskaya actually was the one who typed the manuscript for him, called the Nevada document at the time. They had a lot of discussion about this issue between 1949 and 1953, especially, this three-way correspondence the three of them had. One day, I hope this full correspondence will be published. It hasn't been fully published yet, but some of it is available online, the original manuscripts, through the archives. But there's a fascinating, and I discussed this in a recent book that has come out, Dunayevskaya's Intersectional Marxism. I have a chapter in there that discusses this correspondence on the question of the party formation and an alternative to it within the JFT. But the JFT breaks up after it becomes independent after a few years, in large part because it could not agree on what the positive response or the alternative to the Vanguard Party formation was. Some people generally who James himself and Lee tended to basically say, well, it's all about spontaneity, right? In other words, it's the spontaneous struggles of the masses that creates the form of organization that carries the revolution to its completion. And we don't need the party formation at all, or even an organized expression necessarily of Marxist theoreticians to advance or contribute to that movement. Dunayevskaya was moving in a different direction and saying, no, we don't want the old Vanguard Party, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a role, even for small groups of theoreticians. And by theoreticians, we're not talking about intellectuals only, because workers could also be theoreticians, okay? But small groups of theoreticians who know that nothing can be done without masses of people. You can't make a revolution through a small group. People who imagine such a thing as possible are living in the Middle Ages, by the way. You can't do that in the modern world. But at the same time, spontaneous struggles raise questions that they're looking for answers to, like, hey, what's the alternative to capitalism? If we do seize power or we do bring down the old regime, how do we reorganize society in a way that's going to avoid regressing back into a new bureaucracy or a new form of domination? You need groups, organized groups of revolutionaries that would be committed to addressing that on a systematic and theoretical level. And that's, I think, broke apart the JFT, disagreements over that question. Dunayevskaya went on and wrote a lot about the question of organization through the rest of her life. James's trajectory on this would be an interesting discussion to have on its own. You had Buccaretti interviewed on your show not long ago, who had some
Yep.
very interesting comments to say from James's perspective of this debate. But they went in different directions on this. Dunayevskaya did not go back to the old Leninist conception of the party. James, in a way, oddly kind of did later on when it came to the Third World. That is, he argued that when it comes to the African revolutions, where the working class is such a small part of the population, there you will need a single party to lead. Dunayevskaya didn't buy that either, but that was a big part of the breakup of the JFT.
Mm-hmm. Good.
There was
Thank
also
you.
differences I can go into.
Did they remain friends? I mean, did they stay in correspondence a little bit, or was it just a clean break?
It was a very bitter break.
Mm.
And it's kind of like in a marriage, in
Yeah.
a divorce. Now, sometimes you become friends with your ex, and sometimes you don't. Okay, and splits within the left very often, of course, is one of the many times they're necessary. But one of the downsides of them, of course, is that the bitterness becomes all the deeper the closer you were or are to somebody. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and James in particular, I mean, I'm not just referring to the split between him and Dunayevskaya, but the split between James and Lee exemplifies this perhaps even more, because they had a falling out in 1962 when Lee basically decided that Marxism was more or less passé, and certainly held that she believed now that the working class was no longer a viable revolutionary subject. She had James viewed those sorts of splits as, well, if you're not with me, you're breaking from Marxism. It was a kind of the attitude, right? So
Yeah.
it's really not possible to maintain a relationship on that level. Dunayevskaya and Lee lived in the same city for many years. Of course, James was deported back to England in 1953, just a little bit prior to the breakup of the Johnson-Forrest tenancy, a few years before the breakup of the Johnson-Forrest tenancy. Dunayevskaya moved to Detroit in 1953, and it's a little later, I'm not sure, forget which exact year it is, but Grace moves to Detroit as well. So they would, of course, run into each other, but they were not buddies.
Mm. Okay. So Raya went on to form a new group called the News and Letters Committee. Can you talk about that?
Right. So this was an idea of doing something different. It was an idea of forming a decentralized committee-based form of organization that would not only try to break down the division of workers and intellectuals in a general sense by encouraging workers to write in the newspaper and to actually develop their theoretical abilities, but to actually have workers be in the leadership of the organization and directing it. Okay. So they encouraged as many of their members as possible to move to cities like Detroit, with a very center of the American industrial dynamo at the time, of course, and to become deeply rooted in the industrial working class. Dunayevskaya herself, for a while, lived in Morgantown, West Virginia. She lived in Pittsburgh. She worked with steel workers, coal miners, moved to Detroit. Auto workers become a big part of her life. And you'll see right behind me, right below the portrait of Dunayevskaya that was painted by her husband, by the way, John Dwyer, is a smaller portrait, perhaps you can't see it as well, of Charles Denby, who was a black auto worker who was brought into the radical movement by James. You heard a speech that James gave in 1948 in which James was attacking other socialists for not making a priority of the struggle against racism. And this former sharecropper, who was now working in a factory in Lowndes County, Alabama, and had moved to Detroit, hears this speech and says, that's exactly what I've been looking for. He becomes a major figure in the Johnson-Forrest tenancy, Charles Denby, and he writes a autobiography called Indignant Heart, a Black Worker's Journal. This is probably the first journal of a black worker, Marxist worker, autobiography, trying to address his own path from sharecropping to Marxist revolutionary that was ever published. Very small circulation at the time it got in the 50s, but Dunayevskaya and Denby became very, very close associates, and Denby went with Raya in the split with 1955. He did not go with James, and he became the editor of this newspaper, News and Letters, and the organization that was co-founded by him and Dunayevskaya. And the idea of it was to break down the division of mental and manual labor in the way that a revolutionary organization actually functions. And by doing so, by being a philosophical action group, that was the idea behind it, to actually encourage people to read Hegel, to read Marx, to read the great thinkers of the socialist tradition, to discuss, to study them, in the black radical tradition especially, and to be able to develop a, 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 a kind of a effort to raise questions and about what is the nature of capitalism and what is the alternative to it, that the movement itself can be its own school in raising, developing, and formulating. So the organization was largely based in Detroit. It was never a very large organization, and then there was groups that existed around the country that were associated with it. And I came into contact with the organization after having read Dunayevskaya myself. I had no idea that she was an American or living in the United States at the time. I was reading and studying up on socialist humanist currents in Eastern Europe. I had become very interested in a number of them in Yugoslavia, in Poland, in elsewhere. And I just came across her work and then was shocked to discover when somebody told me, oh, there's a little group in Detroit that actually, and they have some people in New York who actually, discuss her ideas, and she's actually alive and well here in the United States. So I got to meet her and eventually ended up becoming her secretary for the last couple of years of her life. And I worked with her pretty much on a daily basis for the last several years of her life while she was working.
Awesome.
And it was during a period where she was working on a plan book, which she never completed, which was to be called Dialectics of Organization and Philosophy. After her death, I became, after a year or two, one of the co-national organizers of News and Letters. And we did some great work, I think, and it was a very fruitful experience. But by the 2000s, early 2000s, it became clear to a lot of us in the organization that the group was stagnating and was kind of turning Marxist-Humanism more into an ideology than a living body of thought that was constantly in need of development. And we thought that the group was going, to put it mildly, was going stale. And we decided to move in a different direction and formed the International Marxist-Humanist Organization in 2008, which most of them many of the former members of News and Letters came into, but since then, many others who were not part of that tradition earlier. And it's a much richer, more diverse, and much more active organization than News and Letters had become in the years following Dunayevskaya's death. So that's the group that I'm actually active in today, as well as others.
Excellent. So, what is Marxist-Humanism?
Well, that's a big question. I once wrote an essay with that title, and I can send it around if folks want to see it. It's published in a book in India that came out 2 years ago that tries to lay that out. I would mention also that, although it's not the exact title, a Ukrainian Marxist journal was started up recently, like it's about a year ago, in Ukraine, Spilna, which means commune in Ukrainian. And they had asked me for an essay on Marxist-Humanism, where I covered the history and trajectory of Marxist-Humanism as well. And if you go to the website of the International Marxist-Humanist Organization, which is www.imhojournal.org, imhojournal.org, you'll see that writing and some others that address that question. But in terms of here, the basic idea is to recapture and then develop anew the central insight of Marx's work, which is that the fundamental problem of capitalism is that human relations take the form of relations between things. That is the fundamental problem. Now, you can give it any name you want. You can call it alienation. If you don't like that term, you can call it reification. If you don't like that term, you can call it objectification. If you don't like that term, you can call it something else. But the transformation of human relations into relations between things, that's the central object of his critique. Now, of course, in Marx's time, he's looking at the working class, the industrial working class, how their laboring activity is transformed into a relationship as if they were things. Of course, no human being is a thing, but they can be treated as one, as if they were one, okay? And Marx expresses that very clearly in his writings by making certain basic analytical distinctions that it's kind of ABCs. You would think any Marxist would know this. Labor, according to Marx, is not a commodity. Labor power is a commodity. If labor is a commodity, then it means that the activity of laboring becomes a thing. But if the laboring activity becomes a thing, there's no way to resist it. But your capacity or your ability to labor is what is commodified, made into a thing, which means there's always a residue of opposition that's contained within that human subject that can push back against that alienation or reification. And that's basic categories in Marx that signify this type of humanism. That is, if the fundamental problem of capitalism is a transformation of human relations to relations between things, socialism represents the breaking of that. Now, of course, it would have to begin or center, at least for Marx, on the relations at the point of production, because these are the determinate relations in a capitalist society. You can't overturn capitalism without eliminating its class domination. But it doesn't stop there. And if you narrow your conception of Marxism to simply an economic doctrine or a class-based doctrine, according to a Marxist-Humanist perspective, you're missing out on a heck of a lot. Because what is racism when you really think of it deeply? What is racism? And the work of Franz Fanon, who called himself, called for a new humanism, right? That was a clarion call of his first book, Black Skin, White Masks. And in The Wretched of the Earth, he also talks about the need for a new humanism, is the conception that what is involved in racism? Treating the other as a thing. That is not even explicitly, you don't have to engage in a racist explicit action. You don't have to burn a cross in somebody's front lawn to treat them as a thing. All you have to do is glance at them a certain way, give off a certain body language that indicates that you have judged them based on this accidental determination called skin color, which is loaded with all sorts of negative connotations in our society when it comes to blackness. And that is turning a human relationship into a relationship between things. What is also involved in sexism and misogyny? When you abolish abortion rights, as this country is doing, what are women being treated as, right? Oh, so we're supposed to protect the fetus. That's a living thing. But the woman is a thing that simply bears a fetus. And if she violates that right of that fetus, supposedly, she is no good, okay? So, I mean, we're talking about at all kinds of levels, objectification, turning people into a kind of, into embodiments of thingification categories. So a humanist perspective of Marxism and what Marxist humanism therefore tries to do is have a more holistic critique of capitalism in which these different strands of domination and oppression can be identified in such a way that we have a common language to talk about what we want: human freedom, human liberation, end of dehumanization. Different struggles obviously raise these objections to reification and alienation in different ways, because they are different experiences, different struggles. As Fanon once put it, the black man suffers in his body very differently than the white man does, even when the two of them are workers subject to the same form of class domination in general, right? He fully understood that you can't just have a class-based movement which neglects the ways in which racial considerations dehumanize individuals, right? Based on what is considered the default option of whiteness. But the question is, the humanism is that opposite to that dehumanization. And unfortunately, this has not only been lost sight of by the post-Marx Marxists, by the Stalinists, for instance, who had no use for this kind of concept of humanism, because for them it's about power and it's about, privilege, seizing power, etc., privileging one class over another, one party over another. But unfortunately, much of academic Marxism, under the influence of Foucault and postmodernism and many other tendencies over the last several decades, has likewise moved in rejected humanism. It's kind of the opposite side of the same coin as vulgar Marxism. The vulgar Marxists say, no, it's all about economics, and it's not about humanism. The postmodernists say, no, it's not about economics, it's about discourse, and it's not about humanism, because humanism supposedly is responsible for all the horrors of racism, sexism, and capitalism, which, believe me, Marxist humanism is not responsible for those things. Marxist humanism is not the same as an enlightened or bourgeois humanism that says, all men are brothers, that's humanitarianism. And I'm not a humanitarian. I'm a humanist, a revolutionary humanist.
Excellent. Thank you. One final question. What can we do to help unite humanity and heal the planet and the people on the planet?
Well, if I had an answer to that question, I'd be a richer man than I am. That's a very big question, but and it's one of those questions that I would like to know what other people think of. But unfortunately, we're not in this kind of back and forth format right here. But maybe you can send me, anybody listening to this, for your own views on that one. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that we can do is, first of all, is to be a bit humble and to recognize that we're not the masters of our own fate, right? All of us come into the world saturated with the muck of the ages. That is, we're all products of classes, races, sexist, homophobic social relations, institutions, and attitudes, right? And they don't simply get washed out of us by making a speech or writing a book or being on a podcast, okay? So what we need, first of all, to do is listen to voices, listen to those who are struggling, and to try to understand why they're struggling, and what they're struggling for. That's the first thing. You have to listen to the voices of revolt and voices of people who are exploited and suffering, and then try to understand how do we as individuals reorientate the way we view the world in light of them, okay? Because the lens by which we view the world is not of our own making. The lens we've inherited, different ways, different vantage points, perspectives, assumptions, stereotypes that inform the lens by which we view reality and relate to other people. So to be a true critical thinker, which is what anybody who's a revolutionary has to be, means being willing to criticize your own ways of looking at things and ask yourself, is this framework really the proper one? Or does it need improvement or even jettisoning it? So that's just where you begin. That's not where you end. But I would say that the most important thing that we need to do is we need to realize that there's not going to be a change of society that's been run by a single party or a group. It's going to come from the spontaneous activity of masses of people. And you have to do what you can to encourage people in that situation or in those struggles to sustain themselves in the fight. But in order to do that, you also have to give people some hope that a better future is possible. And this is the biggest danger we face today. When we look out and we look forward, we see, okay, now we're back to an imperialist war could be between the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and China. This seems to be the way we're going. We're looking at climate change and this horrible future that's in store for us if this thing is not radically reversed. We're talking about a march backward on women's rights in this country and other parts of the world, even though there's amazing progress being made elsewhere, like in Latin America on women's rights, and very significant movements elsewhere. Nevertheless, it's very easy to lose hope. But I think that anybody who is serious about living an authentic human life has to commit themselves to actually doing something to advance the cause of liberation. And central to that is you need to take responsibility to try to work out with others what's the alternative to the present state of affairs. What is a viable alternative to capitalism? Because that's what we're missing. People don't have a sense of what would be the goal, what would be the specific form of new human relations that would reverse this trajectory that humanity is on. And that's why people are finding it hard to sustain themselves in the struggle. So it's not just standing back and saying, let's wait for the spontaneous struggles to advance and show the way, although that's an important thing one has to do, but one has to intervene and one has to try to develop in dialogue with others what would be a philosophically grounded alternative to capitalism. Because if we have more clarity on that question, I think people would have greater confidence to continue in the fight, because we're going to have a long fight ahead of us.
Excellent, Peter. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. We look forward to having you back. Please, folks, go and check out Peter's books and follow him on social media. I know he's on Facebook, and there are also several really good YouTube video lectures by Peter. I highly recommend one of my favorite podcasts, This is Revolution. They had Peter on last year talking about Frantz Fanon, and I highly recommend that because they thoroughly delve into Fanon and talk a lot about him. So I recommend that. So thanks again, Peter, for joining us, and look forward to talking to you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Gilbert. This is a great opportunity. Thank you so much for having this program.